The Mercer brothers passed the Heller property every morning on their way to the mill, and every morning they found something to laugh about. There was no barn, no wood pile stacked against the wall, no hay shelter, no animal shed, no structure of any kind beyond a small house and its single chimney. 3 cows had arrived with the Heller family in the fall of 1881, and by November, no one in the county could figure out where those cows slept. What the Mercer brothers could see was a German immigrant with dirty hands and 2 teenage sons, spending weeks doing nothing that looked like farming. No framing, no sawing, no hauling of lumber, just walking, just looking at the ground. By December, the joke had spread to the feed store, the post office, and the back pew of the Lutheran church. A man who had lost his building materials to a railroad freight scheme, who had bought the one parcel of land in the county too rocky and too sloped for anyone else to want, was apparently planning to survive a Nebraska winter through stubbornness alone. Then January came, and the winter that broke open that season was not the kind that tests a farm. It was the kind that ends one. If you are watching from somewhere cold tonight, tell us where you are. Stories like this survive because people still care enough to remember them. And if this kind of frontier wisdom matters to you, subscribing helps keep it alive. Amos Heller was 48 years old when he filed his claim on the parcel the county surveyor had labeled, without much ceremony, as Section 14R, a narrow strip of land running up the eastern face of a glacial ridge about 6 miles northwest of the town of Crete, Nebraska. He had been a carpenter of barns in Wurtemberg. He understood timber framing the way some men understand music, by feel, by proportion, by the sound a joint made when it's seated correctly. He had crossed the Atlantic with his wife Clara, his son Ernst, his son Wilhelm, and a contract with a freight company that was supposed to deliver 2,000 board feet of milled lumber, 1,200 pounds of hardware, and enough roofing material to build a structure that would last 40 years. The lumber never arrived. The freight agent in Chicago explained, with a calmness that Amos would remember for the rest of his life, that the paperwork had been filed incorrectly and that the materials had been redirected to a purchaser in Kansas City. There would be a process for reimbursement. The process would take time. Amos had no time. He had a family, a parcel of land, and a Nebraska autumn that was already shortening the days. He spent his first week on the property doing what the neighbors found baffling. He did not go to the lumber yard. He did not ask for credit. He did not hire help or barter labor. He walked the land. He walked it in the morning when the frost was still hard, and he walked it in the afternoon when the sun had softened the south-facing slope. He crouched down and pressed his palm flat against the ground in different places. He dug small test holes with a spade, 18 inches, 2 feet, 3 feet, and stood in each one to feel the air at that depth. His neighbor to the north, a rancher named Peter Voss, watched this from a distance for 3 days before riding over. "What are you looking for?" he asked. Amos looked up from a hole he had dug near the base of the ridge. "I am looking for what is already here," he said. Voss rode home and told his wife that the German on Section 14 had gone soft in the head from the freight trouble. She said she was not surprised. The land up there was no good anyway. The ridge that ran along the eastern boundary of the Heller property was not dramatic by Nebraska standards. It rose perhaps 30 feet above the flat cropland below, and its face was a mixture of clay, compacted glacial till, and a shelf of limestone that pushed through the surface in 2 places like the knuckles of a buried fist. It was a limestone that had kept the parcel unsold for 3 years. You could not plow through it. You could not blast it cheaply. Every other settler in the county had walked the property, looked at that gray rock breaking through the hillside, and turned around. Amos Heller looked at it and saw a wall that had already been built. By his second week on the property, he had mapped the slope carefully, pressing stakes into the ground at intervals and running string between them to trace the contour lines. He was not surveying for farming. He was reading the hill the way he used to read a timber frame, looking for where the load naturally wanted to go, where the ground stayed dry, where the cold air pooled on still mornings and where it did not. The cold air told him the most. On clear nights, cold air drains downhill like water. It collects in low places and leaves the mid-slope warmer than the valley floor below. Amos had observed this in Germany as a boy, watching where the fruit trees his grandfather planted survived the late frosts, and where they did not. The old farmers said the hillside trees had better luck. They did not explain why. They did not need to. He found the place he wanted on the south-facing portion of the ridge, just below the upper limestone shelf. The rock would serve as a natural ceiling reinforcement. The slope would give him drainage. The orientation would shield the entrance from prevailing northwest wind. He brought Ernst and Wilhelm out with picks and shovels on a Tuesday morning in late September, when the ground was still workable. "We are not building up," he told them. "We are building in." Ernst was 17 and did not argue. Wilhelm was 15 and asked why. Because, Amos said, "The hill has been doing this work for 10,000 years. We are only going to use the door it already has." The excavation took 6 weeks. They worked from the outside inward, cutting a sloped entrance channel first, 8 feet wide and angled slightly downward for the first 4 feet, before leveling off as it entered the hillside. The angle was deliberate. Water running downhill during a thaw would reach the entrance, hesitate at the level threshold, and stop. It would not run inside. Amos had learned this from watching how snow melted around rock outcroppings. The melt always ran to the lowest open path and no further. The first failure came in the 3rd week. They had cut a side chamber intended for 3 cows, roughly 14 feet deep and 8 feet wide, following the softer clay seen between 2 harder layers of till. On the 5th day of digging, a section of the ceiling cracked along a line Amos had not seen and dropped 18 inches of earth onto the floor of the chamber. No one was hurt, but the crack traveled 6 feet toward the entrance before it stopped, and Amos spent a full day lying on his back in a low space, pressing his hands against the ceiling, learning the geometry of the failure. What he found was that he had cut the chamber too wide relative to the depth of material above it. The soil was strong in compression, but weak across that span. He needed either to narrow the chamber or to support the ceiling at intervals. He chose to support it. He had no milled lumber, but the ridge had scattered deadfall, twisted hackberry trunks that were nearly useless for framing, but dense enough to serve as uprights. He and the boys cut 8 of them, stripped the bark, and drove them into floor in 2 rows, each pair supporting a crossbeam of the same would lash with wet rawhide that would tighten as it dried. The ceiling held, but the week of repair had cost them time they could not replace. October was already cold. Clara came to see the progress on a Sunday afternoon, picking her way down the entrance channel with her skirt held above the clay. She stood at the threshold of the main corridor, where 3 chambers branched off in darkness, and she was quiet for a long moment. "It smells like the cellar on my father's farm," she said finally. Amos waited. "He kept that cellar at 40 degrees Fahrenheit through July," she said, "without ice." She turned and walked back up the entrance without saying anything else. But Amos understood what she had not said. He worked until dark that night and started again before first light. By the end of October, the earth shelter had 3 functional chambers branching from a central corridor 8 feet long, and just wide enough for a man to pass through with a load of hay. The leftmost chamber, the largest, measured 12 feet deep and 7 feet wide, narrower than the first failed attempt, but sufficient for the 3 cows to stand and turn. The floor had been packed with a layer of fine gravel over the clay subsoil, enough to allow drainage beneath the animals without creating mud. The ceiling was supported at 2 points by the hackberry uprights. The center chamber was intended for hay and stored feed. It was shallower 10 feet and wider 9 feet because hay did not create the same ceiling load as cattle, and the stored feed benefited from a slightly different airflow pattern that Amos had found by hanging damp cloth at various points and watching which way it moved. The rightmost chamber was for firewood. Amos had cut and hauled 4 cords of dry oak and hickory through September, stacking it in the open air to season. Now it went underground, where the constant temperature and low humidity would keep it dry regardless of what the weather above did. The entrance was sealed with a double-door arrangement using planks salvaged from 2 shipping crates and the frame of a broken wagon gate. The outer door faced east. Between the outer and inner door was a gap of roughly 3 feet that served as a buffer against wind. When a man entered carrying a load, he opened the outer door, stepped into the gap, let the outer door close behind him, and then opened the inner door. Cold air never moved freely from outside to inside in a single motion. Peter Voss came by in early November, ostensibly to ask about a property line question, and found Amos tamping clay around the base of the entrance structure. "So this is it," Voss said, looking at what appeared to be a low mound with a wooden door set into the hillside. "This is it," Amos said. Voss looked at the door, looked at the mound, and looked at the empty field where a barn should have been. "Where are the cows sleeping?" he asked. "Inside," Amos said. Voss did not say anything else. He rode back to his property, and that evening he told his wife, and by Sunday it was a subject of quiet conversation at the back of the church. The German on 14 had put his cattle underground like root vegetables. No one was sure whether to feel sorry for him or simply wait. November passed without catastrophe, which some of the neighbors found almost as suspicious as the original decision. The Heller cows were producing milk. The hay in the center chamber was staying dry. The firewood was holding its seasoning. Amos noted the interior temperature each morning by feel and later with a borrowed thermometer. It held steady between 38 and 44 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of what the air above the ridge was doing. On the coldest nights of November, when the open-air temperature dropped below 10 degrees Fahrenheit, the chamber temperature did not move more than 2 degrees. This was not magic. Amos could explain it, and he did explain it to Ernst, who was old enough to want to understand rather than simply accept. The earth, Amos told him, has a temperature of its own, below the frost line, which in this county sits at roughly 3 feet. The ground holds the average annual temperature of the region. In Nebraska, that was somewhere near 50 degrees Fahrenheit. The deeper you went, the more stable that temperature became. The earth did not heat the interior. It prevented the interior from losing heat to the outside air. The difference between a barn losing heat through wooden walls all night and a chamber losing heat through 3 feet of compressed clay was the difference between a fire that had to burn constantly and a fire that only needed to be lit once. The cows produced their own warmth. 3 animals in a sealed space, breathing and metabolizing through the night, generated enough heat to hold a chamber above, freezing even when no other heat source was present. Ernst asked what happened if the animals got sick. "Then we fixed the animals," Amos said. "Same as in a barn." What he did not say, because he did not want to worry his son, was that December was coming, and he had not yet been tested. A mild November in Nebraska meant very little. The winter that had broken families on this prairie in the years before their arrival had not been mild. It had been the kind of winter that arrived before anyone was ready and stayed past the point of reason. He spent the last week of November inspecting every joint in the door frames, repacking clay around any gap he could find, and adding a 3rd layer of hay over the ceiling of the livestock chamber where it was thinnest. Wilhelm asked him if he was worried. "I am careful," Amos said. "Those are different things." The first Sunday of December, a rancher named Clyde Beaumont said, in the fellowship hall after the service, and loudly enough for 3 pews worth of people to overhear, that he had ridden past the Heller land that week, and still could not see a single structure worth the name. A man with cattle and no bar in Nebraska in December, Beaumont said, is either very brave or very foolish, and bravery does not keep cows warm. There was polite laughter. There was also, from the far corner of the room, the sound of a cup being set down on a table with more precision than was strictly necessary. Clara Heller was not a loud woman. She had come to Nebraska from a village in Swabia, where the winters were serious, and the people who survived them did not advertise their preparations. She had watched her father lose a barn to fire in 1859 and rebuild it in 2 weeks with borrowed timber, because a barn above the ground was something a fire could find. She had thought about that fire often in the past 2 months. She did not respond to Beaumont. She collected her coat, found her sons near the door, and walked to the wagon. On the way home, Wilhelm asked her what she thought would happen. She looked at the sky to the northwest, where a line of cloud was sitting on the horizon, the way clouds sit when they have a great deal of weight behind them. "I think we'll find out soon," she said. The temperature dropped 4 degrees that night, then 6 more by morning. The blizzard began on January the 8th, 1882, which local record from the Creek Gazette later noted as the opening of a 3-day weather event that caused a loss of 12 head of cattle in the county and collapsed 1 grain storage structure under accumulated snow load. Amos knew it was coming the morning before it arrived. He had been watching the sky for 2 days. He spent January 7th moving an additional half-cord wood into the firewood chamber, checking the double door seals one final time, and leading the cows through the entrance himself to make sure they would move willingly in the dark. They move without hesitation. Cattle learn to shelter quickly if the shelter is warm and dry. These 3 had been using the chamber since October. They walked in and stood in their places, as if they had always lived underground. He sealed the inner door. He sealed the outer door. He walked to the house. The storm arrived before midnight. By morning, the snow was horizontal. By the afternoon of the second day, the entrance to the shelter was buried under a drift 3 feet deep, and Amos and Ernst took turns going out in shift to keep a breathing channel open at the top of the entrance mound. They used a broom handle to probe the snow above the door and confirmed the air gap was clear. It always was. The door faced east. The dominant wind was from the northwest. The drift was building on the wrong side of the mound. On the night of the second day, Peter Voss lost 2 of his 5 cows to cold exposure when the wind found a gap in his barn's north wall that the framing nails had widened over 2 years of settling. He sat in his kitchen by lamplight and did not speak. On the morning of the 3rd day, the wind dropped. Amos went out at first light and cleared the entrance. He opened the outer door, then the inner door. The temperature inside the livestock chamber was 36 degrees Fahrenheit. The cows were standing. The hay was dry. The firewood had not been touched. He stood in the entrance for a long moment. Then he went back to the house and told Clara. She was already making coffee. "I know," she said. "I could hear them moving last night." Word traveled the way word travels in a small county after a hard storm, slowly at first, in fragments, and then all at once. The Mercer brothers came first, 2 days after the blizzard, supposedly to borrow a harness tool. They found Amos clearing the drift from the entrance channel and accepted his offer to come inside and see the structure. They stood in the central corridor and looked at the chambers. One of them reached out and touched the wall, pressing his palm flat against the clay the way Amos had done the first week on the property. "It's warm," he said. "It is the same temperature it was in October," Amos said, "and it will be the same temperature in July." Peter Voss came on a Thursday. He did not bring a pretense. He stood at the property line until Amos waved him over, and then he walked down the entrance and looked at the livestock chamber for a long time. "I lost 2, he said. "I heard," Amos said. "I am sorry." Voss was quiet. He looked at the hackberry uprights, at the gravel floor, at the double-door arrangement that Amos had built from salvage. "How long did it take?" he asked. 6 weeks to dig, Amos said. 2 more to correct the mistakes. Voss nodded slowly. Clyde Beaumont came on a Saturday. He came alone, without his usual ease, and he kept his hat in his hands the entire time he was on the property. He asked 2 questions. He listened to both answers without interrupting. When he left, he said only that he appreciated the time. Amos did not mention the fellowship hall. There was no reason to. By March, he had shown the entrance design and the chamber dimensions to 7 families in the county. He drew the cross-section on paper and let them copy it. He explained the importance of the entrance angle, the ceiling span limits, the door buffer, the east-facing orientation. He charged nothing. Ernst asked him why he did not at least take something for the drawings. Because, Amos said, the knowledge was not mine to sell. The Hill knew it first. I only learned to read what the Hill had already written. The following autumn, for families on the eastern ridge broke ground on earth shelters of their own. 2 followed Amos's design almost exactly. One modified the entrance to face south for better winter light. One dug a 4th chamber for root vegetable storage and found, as Amos could have told him, that the temperature was ideal. None of them lost livestock that winter. The earth shelter on Section 14 are stood for another 19 years. When Ernst Heller finally built a timber barn in 1901, after the family had saved enough to do it properly, he kept the underground chambers running alongside it. He used them for cool storage through the summer months, when a constant 50-degree temperature underground was more valuable than any ice house he could have built above the ground. The Mercer brothers, in later years, told the story at a different angle, as a story about a clever German who had figured something out that everyone else had missed. They told it with a kind of ownership, the way people tell stories about events they witnessed, as though witnessing were the same as understanding. Amos did not correct them. He had stopped walking the property the way he walked it in that first autumn. He no longer needed to. But sometimes, on mornings when the temperature had dropped overnight and the ridge was white and the valley below was still gray with cold, he would stand at the entrance of the shelter and press his hand against the clay wall inside. It was always the same. The warmth was always there, not because the earth made it, because the earth had simply refused, quietly and without argument, to let it leave. This story is presented for educational and historical storytelling purposes. It is not engineering, construction, or safety advice.